Hello, I'm Bill Booz, and this is Learning Photography, Episode 4. This is the first in a series of 3 episodes for Learning Photography that will form the foundation for everything we talk about later on in future episodes. As I showed you in a little sampling in Episode 3, my intention is to go outside with my camera or throughout my house with my camera or at parks or wherever and video my process of assessing a scene, deciding what exposure I want to use, and showing that to you as I take the picture. And then when I take the picture, showing you the results, showing you the good, showing you the bad. So that will be the normal way that I will produce these episodes. But for these first 3, to form this foundation, I want to talk about some groundwork for that. And in Episode 4 today, we're going to talk about light. And light is the essential ingredient for making photographs, and how we control that light through typically three essential functions of a camera: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. Now, there are lots of videos on YouTube and lots of blog posts about how you control these elements of your camera. And I recommend that you take a look at those. I'll put some links in the description below. But this is really meant to be sort of somewhat of a superficial covering of those 3 elements. And then in Episode 5 next, we will talk about how each of those elements, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, how they control specific things and why you choose to prioritize aperture, for example, and what can you expect as a result in your photograph. And then thirdly, and to round it up, in Episode 6 we'll talk about the physical controls of your camera, the buttons and dials that are on your camera that allow you to control those 3 elements as well as many other elements that are essential to establishing a exposure that will give you the image that you were expecting, the image that your eyes saw. And sometimes the camera doesn't get quite right. So when you take control of your camera, you can help the camera to get it right. Your brain is always better than the camera. And when we get to Episode 7, we'll start working outside or in the house, depending on the weather, on how to apply those elements, how to apply the control of those elements to create your images. So let's get started with Episode 4. I do a lot of one-to-one tutoring to help people use their cameras more effectively, or in some cases they just got a new camera and they want to know how it works. There have been many people with whom I've worked who've been shooting for a long time. They're accomplished photographers, but they've usually worked in an automatic mode. Maybe not auto, but they've worked in an automatic mode, and they'd like to know a little bit more about how to manage the controls that their camera provides them with. And so I usually start off, depending on their level of understanding, and let's assume that they are brand new to this, I usually start off with what we're going to talk about right now, and that is what features of your camera are essential to control if you want to take control of making an image. So often we put our camera in auto mode. There's nothing wrong with auto mode. Auto mode is wonderful, particularly in the more recent cameras. I mean, this gets better and better. But the camera can always be fooled by the environment, by white snow or white sand, or a very dark situation that will change how the meter in your camera, the light meter in your camera, assesses the whole frame. And we'll end up giving you a picture. Have you ever taken a picture of a friend of yours standing in front of a window or in front of a very sunny scene, and you looked at the image and he or she is almost a silhouette? That's because the camera was fooled by all that brightness behind your subject. So we're going to talk about how you can overcome that by working in not a totally auto mode, although we'll experiment with several modes. Primarily we're going to work in the manual mode, because in the manual mode you have control over everything. And then there are other modes such as aperture priority and shutter priority and program mode, where you give up certain things for the camera to figure out while you figure out the other part. And so we'll talk, the pros and cons of doing that and when it's really appropriate to choose one over another. So when I meet with a new client, student, I find out where they are, as I said, in their understanding of photography and what their camera can do, and usually with a discussion of the exposure triangle. So I'm going to draw some pictures, which is something I also do, and then I give them the paper. In this case, you could just replay this, but the exposure triangle is indeed a triangle. And the three elements at each of the corners of the triangle are aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. So, what we have is controls. So these, I refer to these as controls. Aperture is like your eye. If you go into a dark room, you can't see anything. Let's say it's an office, and there's lamps. There are a couple lamps. There's a desk. There are all sorts of objects in that room, but the shades are drawn, or the curtains are drawn, or maybe there are no windows, and so it's totally dark, and your eyes see nothing. But eventually, if you stand in the middle of that room, within a few minutes, sometimes even faster, your eyes dilate. Just like when you go to the eye doctor and they put drops in your eyes so that it kind of opens up your eye more so the doctor can really give a thorough examination of your eyes. That's dilating your eyes. And if you've gone to an eye doctor, you know what that feels like. So same thing happens when you're in this dark room. After you stood there for a while, your brain opens up your eyes more, and things start. You can discern objects. You can't really see them real well, but you can at least tell there's a desk there, there's a lamp on the desk, and there's a chair over there, and so you get a feel for it. And then if you immediately walk outside in a bright sun, you'll squint. Your body contracts your eyes, closes down your eyes so that all that sun doesn't come in and blind you, really. Same thing as when you leave the doctor. They usually give you sunglasses if you didn't bring some with you, because the bright sun and your eyes are dilated. It takes a while when the chemicals dilating your eyes for your eyes to get back to normal. So that's the way an aperture works. When it's wide open, it allows a lot of light in. So in a dark area or like dusk in the evening, and it's starting to get a little bit dark, you want to have a wide open aperture so that more light comes in through the lens. And the same thing is true if there's too much light. You want to close down the aperture. And so an aperture, let's change our picture here a little bit. An aperture is really an opening in the camera that allows light through the lens. So let's say this is an aperture of 16. And that number is not arbitrary. It's a math figure. I don't want to scare you by math, but it is a number that is divided into the f, the focal length. So we call it f16. And that's a small hole. And this is a little bit bigger than it probably is. And then the next aperture setting or value as we go to a larger opening is twice as big. So twice as much light comes in at f11. And then the next one down, and these are called stops. And so from here to here is called a stop. And that has to do with the old cameras where you actually turned the dial and it would stop because it was like a notch. And so from here to here is one stop. The next stop down is, again, twice as big. So we're allowing twice as much light to come in. So this is like our eyes opening up as we're in that dark room. And I'm not going to put the F, but that's 8. And then the next one is 5, 6. And as I said, the math is not important. What's important is that you understand a big number means a little hole. And as we get over here to 4, it's getting bigger. And I'm not an excellent drawer, so this is not to scale by any means. And the next one is 2.8. And the next one is 2. So each of these is a stop. And the next one is 1.4. Now if you'll notice, every other one is a double. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 4 is 8. 8 times 2 is 16. 1.4 times 2 is 2.8, and so on. So there is a pattern. But the important thing, as I said, is that F16, a big number, is a very, very small hole. 1.4, a small number, is a very, very big hole. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into what aperture controls in the next episode. So that's aperture, and that's one of the points in the exposure triangle. The second is shutter speed, and shutter speed is fractions of a second, and that is, the shutter is like a curtain. It closes, your lens allows light to enter the camera. So if we take a side view of a camera with a lens on it, light comes in to the lens, and how much light actually comes in is determined by the aperture. Whether the light can even get in is determined by the shutter. So the shutter, as I said, is a curtain that is back here. Because where this light is going is a sensor inside your camera, which is basically digital film. So in the old days, that's where your film was, in a camera that you turn the film canister. And so the shutter opens and allows light to come in and then closes. And how fast that open and closing happens is shutter speed. And as I said, shutter speed is fractions of a second. So if we have a shutter speed of 1 second, that's a lot. A second is a long time in exposing the scene. And then let's just jump to 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, but it's really 1/15. This is another math oddity. And then 1/30th, and you'll notice a pattern here, right? 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 4 is 8, but it's not every other one, it's the next one, because each slowing down, so this is slower, each slowing down of the shutter is halving the amount of time that the shutter is actually open, the speed with which it opens and closes, until we get to a point of 1/60th of a second. And 1/60th of a second, I like to term the normal shutter speed. That's the shutter speed that most people, most humans, can hold a camera steady without any support. The slower it gets, actually this is slow, I'm going the wrong way here, aren't I? This is slower. So this is faster when we go that way. Faster. It's a faster shutter speed, but allowing less light, less time for the light to hit the sensor. And then another math oddity is 1/125. But the next one picks up the math again, 1/250. And from there on up to 1/4000 or 1/8000, whatever the highest or fastest shutter speed is on your camera, that is still 2 times each one. So that's a stop. So again, this is a stop as it relates to shutter speed. My pencil's giving out on me. So that's referred to as a stop, a full stop. The third element is ISO. ISO is an abbreviation for International Standards Organization, back when you know, in the 70s and before, earlier, we talked about ASA, the American Standards Association. You're familiar with the song Kodachrome 64, and that's what that 64 was. It was an ASA value for the sensitivity of the film. So we don't use film. I mean, some people are using film, but in our digital cameras we don't have film, we have a sensor. And so we're looking at being able to change the sensitivity of that sensor by increasing or decreasing a value. The least sensitive value or for your sensor in most digital cameras is 200. Many digital cameras support an ISO of 100, and even some support 50. But for example, my Olympus cameras have 200 as their natural base ISO, although there is a 100, and that 100 is achieved through software and through the computer mechanisms in the camera. So it's not a real ISO. But so let's assume that we start at 100, and 100 is the least sensitive because there's lots of light in the environment. Ambient light. You're out in a sunny day. You set your camera to 100, or in my case to 200. All right. So as it gets dark, if you're taking pictures at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a sunny day, and you're in the wintertime, by 5:30 or so, it's starting to get dark, and by 6, it might even be pitch black, or by 7, certainly it's dark. You know, and I live in the northern hemisphere on the East Coast, so you want to make your sensor more sensitive, so that it can still record an image even in dusky conditions, that is to say, darker conditions. And so you go to an ISO of 400, for example, or 800, or 1600. And again, that's a stop. From 800 to 1600 is a full stop. And you'll notice the pattern is, as it gets more sensitive, going this way, more sensitive, the numbers get higher. And 100 times 2 is 200, times 2 is 400, etc. So this is when there is lots of light and little light. Now, today's cameras will often go way beyond 1600. If you have a point-and-shoot camera, 1600 might be its max, 3200 might be its max. But the most cameras today will certainly go to 6400, some to 12,800 and beyond. So you just look at your ISO settings and you can see what your camera supports. But this is when there is lots of light in the case of ISO. So this is ISO, this is shutter speed, and this is aperture. ISO 100 means I'm taking pictures outside in a bright sunny day. It's gotten really dark. It's gotten darker at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, or it's a cloudy day, and I go to 800 because I need more sensitivity in my sensor. Now, choosing each of these has an effect, and we'll talk about the effect with each one of them. So for example, we're with ISO, so let's talk about ISO. In ISO, the more sensitive you make your sensor, in other words, the higher the number, the poorer the resolution of the picture itself. And again, with newer cameras, this has been improved, letting you use a high ISO and still have a very an acceptable image. But the degradation of your image shows up in the shadows mainly. And it used to be called graying in film days. Now we refer to it as digital noise. And if you ever take a picture, particularly with a compact camera or a smartphone camera, because the sensor is small. The sensor is a little rectangle that when it's a full frame sensor, it's actually the size of an old 35mm negative. And so everything below that or above that constitutes in the lower end, crop sensors, and in the higher end, full sensors or larger, or full frame sensors or larger. The sensor in your smartphone camera or even in a compact camera is tiny, and so it can't really collect as much light as easily. But manufacturers will compress as many cells in there as possible to collect light. And the higher you go with the ISO number, the more digital noise you get. So if you look at an image that you've taken in a dark sort of situation, or where there's shadows, with a smartphone camera or a compact camera, and zoom in on it, you'll see digital noise, and it usually manifests itself in speckles, if it's a color image, in speckles of different colors, purples and reds and yellows and greens and so on. So that's digital noise. With shutter speed, and that's the disadvantage of using a higher ISO. So I like to refer to the ISO as your trump card. It's the just in case you need it, but you don't use it. You try to keep it always at whatever your base ISO is on your camera. All right, we'll stop with that and pick up on the negatives and the positives of putting priority on shutter speed and aperture in our next episode, episode 5. But that covers the basics of the exposure triangle. So I hope that's helpful to you. And not a little bit overwhelming. As I said, there are lots of videos where people explain this in different ways, and it's a good thing to look at different points of view, different ways that people explain the exposure triangle to you as you are becoming more comfortable with taking control of your camera. I appreciate very much your checking in, and I hope this was useful to you. As I said, it's one of the first 3 building blocks towards the series I'm doing with learning photography. If you found this useful, I would certainly appreciate a like. And if you think that this is something that might be helpful to you, and you're not local and not able to do a one-to-one session with me, I hope you'll subscribe and be watching out for my upcoming episodes in learning photography. Thank you very much for checking in. Good day.